Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Vienna is one of my favorite cities, and I'm very impressed with this new campus, which I didn't know about. Before I began, or about 15 minutes ago, Professor Bludorn said I'm supposed to rattle the cage. I don't know if I can do that, but I'm going to try to be controversial. It depends a bit upon who I'm talking to as to whether this is controversial or not, but let me assume that let me hope it is controversial and build a discussion from there. So this emerged out of many years of teaching environmental politics and looking for something I could tell my students that was positive. My course came to be known as the bad news course. And, you know, other than saying put on rubber boots and try to clean the river, it was not easy. So I was looking around. And this is a kind of summary of my thoughts, discoveries and thoughts. Because I didn't know where I was going when I started out. So I want to talk about climate crisis and the future of democracy or environmental democracy during hard times ahead. So try to keep this in mind. What I'm saying doesn't exactly apply tomorrow, but later in a time when today's assumptions won't necessarily be operative. Environmentalism has always been about crisis, from silent spring, limits of growth, ozone hole, biodiversity, and now climate crisis. To be sure, there have been environmental improvements, and the classic example is the glass is either half full or half empty. At least until we get to climate change, which I think we can say is the crisis, potentially the crisis par excellence, the crisis of the 21st century. 2 degrees of Celsius warming or more brings us to tipping points that portend a genuine ecological decline, and we are well on our way to 2 or more, and especially since the last American presidential election, when we have now the climate deniers in the White House and the Environmental Protection Agency and others. We even have the head of ExxonMobil as the Secretary of State. This wouldn't be so problematic if it weren't the case that the U.S. is literally the environmental culprit on the stage. So, to set the stage for the discussion at hand, it's important to grasp the full dimensions of the crisis scenarios. And here I draw on the work of Raskin, Homer-Dixon, Holmgren, and Dwyer in particular. The underlying point: the climate crisis threatens to throw the world as we know it into socio-ecological turmoil and even possibly chaos. Countless studies regularly predict massive hunger around the world, destructive storms, devastating floods, lack of drinkable water, new patterns of disease, deadly heat waves, endless streams of desperate people migrating in search of livable conditions, economic decline, growing levels of social turbulence, violent protests, and more. Actually, of course, we can see all of these things today. The scenarios suggest that they will get much worse. As the crisis scenarios portend, these developments will bring more than just an ecological crisis. They threaten a political crisis as well. Generally less discussed is the fact that the climate crisis will threaten democratic institutions and civil liberties as people grow more fearful, selfish, intolerant, and xenophobic. If powerful institutions are unable to control these conflicts, the result can lead, according to the scenarios, to general breakdown and even some form of barbarism. One American general in Africa said it looked like Mad Max already, if you're familiar with that strange film. I don't know if these scenarios are true, but I think it's time to consider them, not to write them off, because if they are true, and we don't attend to the consequences, we're in for real big trouble. This will extend, this breakdown, these conditions will extend and exacerbate a politics of fear, with elites withdrawing to protected territories, building what Raskin calls fortress world, designed to defend privileged enclaves from militant uprisings of the poor and oppressed populations that surround them, including new waves of terrorism against the fortress. In retreat from globalization, police states will enforce something of a planetary apartheid with separate realms of well-off and poor divided by authoritarian institutional and legal regimes, according to these scenarios. A new kind of militant, educated, excluded, and angry, will fan the flames of discontent with criminal and terrorist activities against the fortress, perhaps involving biological weapons and maybe even nuclear weapons in some cases, perhaps in the case of Pakistan and India. In short, we speak here of fundamental changes to our way of life as we know it, to one degree or another, and some would say, even Paul Krugman, not known for his outlandish statements, said survival of civilization. In face of such a catastrophic downward spiral, socioeconomic and ecological, anything that might look like democracy will take a back seat, I'm arguing. Oh, we can move this thing along. I'm not much of a PowerPoint person, but I always go through the whole thing and then remember I didn't change anything. But it's not very elaborate anyway. During periods of crisis, democracy is generally put on the shelf, World War being a primary example, with limits placed on civil liberties, a turn to centralized planning of scarce resources, and even a primary role for the military in an all-out effort to deal with the emergency at hand. The Pentagon already makes plans for this state of emergency based on such scenarios. They have their own scenarios which basically come to the same sort of conclusions. They do this in the name of environmental security, and they have a very large division in the Pentagon focused just on this. And I fear people will support this, particularly when the lights start to go dim. We can only speculate as we move into uncharted territories. In fact, that's really what I want to do, is I want to speculate, to promote a discussion around such speculation, which is basically missing from political science and much of the social sciences. So, we can only speculate as we move into uncharted territories, but expert scenarios suggest serious tragedy from anywhere from 40 years to 100 years, if we stay on the current trajectory, for sure. Even if we change, we'll still encounter significant changes, because a lot of that stuff is already up there. If democracy is put on the shelf, then for how long? 40 years? 100 years? Longer? Who knows? World War II was 5 years. There would be whole generations that never experienced democracy and might well hold it responsible, perhaps with good reason, for the situation under which they find themselves living. This portends a more techno-authoritarian form of government, often in the name of security, and some prefer to say survivalism. Some argue that China will have the best chances because it can already direct its economy from above, but Sherman and Smith, whom we discussed last night, suggest the technocratic model of governance in Singapore as a better model, which they describe as benevolent technocracy, friendly technocracy. And I've learned that China has taken a great interest in the Singapore model. Authoritarianism, to be sure, cannot solve the ecological crisis. But what it can do, for a period of time in any case, is protect the fortress. All of this contrasts sharply with academic environmental discourses, which was actually my springboard. Here we find talk of the need for democracy, more democracy, environmental or ecological democracy as a necessary component, even solution to this problem. More deliberation as the solution. Democratic participation has always been part of the environmental movement, which is one of the considerations behind this conference, brought us together. And participation is a core component in theories of sustainable development, all of which is to be commended. I'm not critical of that. I'm only worried about the time frame. I would say we are running short on time for these things to occur. Much of this talk in environmental discourse is a kind of rhetoric, normative rather than grounded in empirical experience, when we're honest with ourselves. The environmental movement went professional in the 1980s, even technocratic, often leaving citizens behind, especially grassroots citizens' environmental movements, which actually gave rise to the environmental movement. This technical professionalization is one of the pillars of the dominant hope, I would say mainstream hope, that technology will save us somehow, but there's no Manhattan-like crash program working on this. Geoengineering, nuclear power, carbon capture, synthetic biologies, even if they have a role to play, they're coming way too slow. To this, we need to add the fact that liberal democracy has thus far failed to come to grips with this problem. Some say that it is the problem rather than the solution. On top of this, democracy around the world is thin and getting thinner. We speak of a crisis of representative government, a democratic deficit, and yes, post-democracy. Moreover, less than 50% of the people around the world live in under any kind of regime that could even vaguely be called democratic. Most of them are already authoritarian. And now we have the Trumps, Putins, Duterte, Modi, all emerging, often in the name of populism, with just this sort of demagogic, authoritarian rhetoric and practices. But the literature on environmental political theory remains focused on highly theoretical discussions about deliberative democracy, quite removed from imminent political realities. Indeed, such theory has shifted to the idea of global deliberative democracy, including climate change policy. In my experience, few people really believe that global environmental democracy is going to emerge in time to save us. Even most theorists will concede this in private, but not necessarily in print. Theorists like Robert Gooden, by contrast, have argued that the substantive logic of ecology is not compatible with the procedural logic of democracy. Some thinkers point to or call for more political authoritarian orientations, the so-called eco-authoritarians, and there's a long list in the literature from Opels, although he's often misunderstood, to Westra, James Lovelock, who basically says we have to concede that the people can't do this. This sometimes involves a call for an ecological elite, a council of ecologists, a kind of court to ensure that ecological boundaries are not overstepped, particularly the work of Rudolf borrow, although borrow is a bit misunderstood there too. If we speak today of the crisis of democracy, democracy will only come under more stress tomorrow. I thus argue that we need a more strategic political theory, one that will address possible strategies for saving democratic values, perhaps saving these values for a future time. If we put it on the shelf, do we bring it back? Although we've had the discourse of sustainable development for 25 years or so or more, and one international summit after the other devoted to it, we have scarcely dealt with this coming crisis, only marginally at best. Moreover, large numbers of people, in face of the evidence, remain in denial or simply don't want to hear about a crisis of this crisis, a kind of fatalism in the view of Ulrich Beck, a crisis which appears to challenge our human capacities to respond. So we need to look for alternative political strategies, even perhaps survivalist strategies, to speak to this tragic eco-political prospect. I say prospect, but it looms large enough to start talking about it, I say, including its implications for the future of democratic governance. So I've actually sort of turned it around. The argument is we need more democracy, but I'm actually asking whether democracy will survive this, and how will we then, what strategies could we take to sustain it in some form, save it, keep the values alive, that sort of thing. And I basically found myself, actually, I would say reluctantly, I resisted my own conclusions. But based on my empirical investigations, I sort of swallowed and argued that we have to return to the local. The neglected alternative at hand, already at hand. There's growing frustration with the failures of the attempts to establish effective global environmental agreements to mitigate warming, already resulting in a shift of emphasis toward adapting urban centers to the coming crisis, dealing with key issues like water levels, building construction requirements, public health, poverty, hunger, overcrowding, and more. Well, that's about where I am. Oh, I did that. Oh, no, it's good. Urban planning, in fact, today is increasingly environmental planning. One conference after the other focuses on sustainability or resilience. A prominent illustration is found in the book of Benjamin Barber on cities, climate change and democracy. His message: forget about global agreements. Rely on local city efforts. Although he implies that cities are more democratic because they're closer to the people, I think we have to say that cities are not the model if we are looking for democratic decision-making. But inside of cities, we find other possibilities. One is the transition town movement, which has been praised by many environmentalists as the most prominent development on the scene. Upon closer look, however, transition town activities are seen to be ecological projects, often small, rather than democratic initiatives. They're not social arrangements, but rather houses about houses and gardens. Indeed, the movement is avowedly apolitical, in the words of its guru, to avoid being corrupted. Then, outside of cities, though, we find a strong eco-localist alternative. Flying in large part under the radar of academic social science and mainstream media, we discover a surprisingly large, vibrant, and growing movement of alternative community organizations of various sizes and shapes, which David Schlossberg and De Florian depicted in the last 2 days, among others. In large part, they are organized and motivated by efforts related to sustainable agriculture and renewable energy, but not only. Indeed, some of these offer impressive examples of participatory action. Actually, the book is about participatory governance, and I set out to find examples of it. One is what was known as the People's Planning Campaign in Kerala, India, which interestingly was organized by the Communist Party in India, or one of the Communist parties in India. But in India, nothing is straightforward. But Communist parties are not known for organizing democratic decision-making, but they did it. The community forest movement in Nepal, which developed an incredible deliberative framework that reached from the top of, from the bottom, from the mountains so it went actually geographically went in reverse, from the people in the forest, in the mountains, to the central government, and became also a part of the democratic revolution in that country. And the example I want to talk about here, another one, is the eco-village movement, which I knew nothing about when I started this, but sort of tripped across different people and visited different eco-villages and so forth. I became quite impressed with what I saw. Flying in large part under the radar of, did I say that? No, it sounds like I said this already. We discovered this, where was it? Oh yeah, okay. In contrast to deliberative democratic theorizing, these projects, which is what really impressed me, relate to ongoing democratic struggles, practical struggles in the real world. They emerged to confront them. Rooted in local activities, they challenge centralized forms of power, both technocratic and authoritarian. In the context of ecological crisis, I argue that this local orientation takes on a special significance. Kirkpatrick Sale, who was an important ecologist and progressive writer in the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, has documented the way people throughout history have returned to the local in face of crisis at the center. He shows that people in crisis tend to go back to the local, often establishing local communities, communes, and other decentralized forms of governments, pointing to the Paris Commune, councils of government, in Munich after World War I, popular governments in Hungary in 56, in Iran in 79, and so forth. Hannah Arendt noted local communes and councils have appeared after every revolution in the 19th and 20th centuries. Indeed, according to the climate crisis scenarios, many people will, in fact, return to the land seeking sustainable conditions, often growing their own food, just as we see in places today like Greece and other parts of southern Europe. And it's just here we find what I have taken to be the most important and overlooked participatory eco-local alternative. And that is the eco-village movement, the global eco-village movement as a form, a dramatic form really, an impressive form of participatory governance. You can find a kind of spectrum of these things. I present this one as the most specific, highly developed form. A phenomenon that is not as small and insignificant as one might think. I mean, I knew nothing. We invited a woman, Karen Litvin, who wrote about this, a very important book, to a conference on global local relations, and she showed up with a paper on eco-villages, and we thought, oh no. We expected ozone discourse or something like this. And we didn't really know what to do, but she finessed it because it was the global eco-village network, right? And I then, it's kind of strange, but one thing after the other. Then I met a woman in Germany who wrote her PhD on this and said, well, I could tell you how to go to one of these places, or I could take you, and it just sort of started that way. And this was also something I was resisting in a certain way, because I didn't want to have to stand here and tell you people that we have to go to eco-villages, which is actually not what I'm going to do. But I think they have a role to play. There is a global network of about 2,000 of these around the world, featuring all varieties. Many reinvent earlier pre-industrial technologies, like farming with a horse. But some are high-tech. Some even have laboratories to test biodiversity and things like this. And a few are even located in cities, such as Los Angeles, Cleveland, and in Berlin. Almost entirely overlooked by political and social theorists, eco-villagers are doing the very things that social and political theorists otherwise preach. The primary eco-village goal is to lower the ecological footprint, guided by ecological theories of permaculture and Gaia. I had no idea how complex permaculture was. They seek to pioneer an alternative socio-ecological model for sustainable living in a future world of hardship. That's what they say they're doing. They recognize, an extremely important point, they recognize that eco-village life is not for everyone, and they don't advertise it as such. Instead, they seek to learn lessons that can be passed on and applied by others, including transition towns. We actually had discussions about this. They even talk about what will happen When others, in face of the hardships, come to their door, they can't take them in. They're limited capacity, so they try to focus on developing things that they could offer to other people, or what has been called the great reskilling. But even more important for present purposes, the purposes of this conference, most of them practice a consensus-based form of participatory environmental democracy. They actually operate by consensus, which is not easy. Especially interesting is the fact that they have experienced and struggled with the traditional problems plaguing democracy. For example, people are too busy to participate and attendance drops off in their own group, or people say, well, I'm not interested in that issue or something. But even more significant, they search for solutions to these problems, and some you could even describe as sort of practical theorists. They write pamphlets about this, about consensus democracy, blogs and books about their participatory experiences. The literature is much larger than one would think. They offer proposals and new practices, theories and practices of something they call sociocracy, or most interesting, consensus minus one, because in a consensus system, one person can block the whole thing, but you have to get on with life. So they develop schemes where this one person, okay, can block, but then you have to do X, Y, and Z. And in other times they say you can only have 6 blocks in your whole time in this eco-village, and then you're finished, and so forth. But if you block, you have to come up with alternatives and so forth. Anyway, they struggle with this. The sociocracy approach reduces the consensus model and develops a kind of set of working circles that are integrated. This is being experimented with, but it's not clear that this will become the final, will fully replace the consensus model. In any case, up to this point, however, they've largely been ignored because they're local, and thus seen as irrelevant in a globalizing world, according to environmental political theorists who have gone global. I'm guilty. I mean, globalization changed the way I live, and I'm sure that's true for many of you. But in the course of this, they've been written off as just a bunch of, well, hippies, some say. But in the ones that I visited, these people look pretty much like you and me, and often have college degrees. Further, they don't fit into the ecological reform orientation that replaced the radical ecologists of an earlier era, emphasizing lifestyle changes and protest politics. They do live outside and sort of parallel to the main social structures of society, but they are not apolitical. In the ones that I visited, they were constantly monitoring ecological events, and they were the first one. One of the main ones I went to is called Siebenlinden, and it's near Gorleben, where the German government tries to put the nuclear waste. So they're the first group to be chained to the rails. It's not apolitical. In fact, much of what they do closely corresponds, in my reading, to what earlier radical ecologists like Murray Bookchin, who developed a rather elaborate system of a kind of associative democracy that linked communes together, or Kirkpatrick Sale's bioregionalism, or even work by Barrow. In one of these places, I actually met a guy who was in Barrow's commune. He started with Barrow. I couldn't believe it. And we sat in this meet. I was invited to come to this meeting to talk about some issues. And I could have been an academic. He says, "What are we talking about? We've talked about this question for 25 years." I mean, you know, it's the way it goes. So most of these have been rejected as utopian, if not too radical, read incompatible or unworkable. But now, in the not all too distant future, if the crisis scenario holds, I argue the social logic changes, as desperate people will be trying to escape polluted cities with fleeing hardships in the city, if not unlivable cities. In this case, driven by need, not by idealism. In this light, eco-villages, in my view, can suddenly take on new importance. Not now, but later. While eco-villages are not the solution, per se, they'd be the first to say this, they need, I argue, from what I've seen, to be a component of future strategies, including eco-neighborhoods, which is another variant which actually draws directly from the eco-village movement, not to mention eco-villages in cities, eco-districts such as Vaudan in Freiburg, inside of cities. Toward this end, we need public policies to support them. Many existing laws make it difficult. Incorporation laws. This is especially true if you try to build one in a city. The zoning laws are really informable. Sources of financial support, tax laws for people who share their income. There's no category. The German government doesn't know how to deal with the incorporation of eco-village, for example. This is an ongoing thing. In Italy, there's been legislation introduced to cover eco-villages. It was defeated, but it's still going on. There's an elaborate network of them in Italy, among other places. At minimum, I argue, they should be part of the mix of strategies that we will need. There's no one model for the future, but I think this is a rather impressive, exemplary organization, activity that requires the attention I'm giving it. And take this case. I forgot to mention, the eco-village, global eco-village movement is actually, has status as a UN observer. And the government of Senegal, which has a country with a lot of poor people and a lot of villages, went to the Global Eco-Village Network and asked them to help them build eco-villages in Senegal, which not only has 350 eco-villages, it has a ministry for eco-villages. So, coming to an end. Even if the crisis somehow fizzles out, let's say we get lucky and the deniers were right. All of this would still be good for the revival of democracy. It should be noted that the local has always been seen as the foundation of genuine democratic participation, this local face-to-face level. Important for representative government and as such a response to the democratic deficit. Not everybody wants to be engaged in democratic participation, but it's a bit odd in advanced democratic countries that there are so few places where a person could actually go and engage in this sort of activity. I used to tell my students, I'm the professor of political science, but I don't know where I'd tell you to go if you want to get involved in some democratic real organization in which you're just not a name on a list. As well, so it's a contribution to that, as well as fulfilling its more standard role in the theory and practice of a sustainable society. I would say if you read the literature, early literature on sustainable development, it actually describes something that looks eco-village-like. But if the catastrophic crisis does hit in full force, the eco-village can be seen as a location, an arena, from which democratic values and practices can be not just practiced, now this will sound weird, but even preserved for or during dark times. If we were to enter into another dark age, as some people have suggested, even a prominent climatologist used this phrase in the New York Times not so long ago. Dark age foreseen by some prophets, the eco-village could potentially assume the role played by monasteries in the Dark Age that preserved existing knowledge for a later time, in particular, in this case, knowledge of democratic values and practices. That's a bit far out, but who knows what's coming. By way of conclusion, then, one can in any case say that radical social changes are heading our way, and it's time to start considering radical solutions. Eco-localism and eco-villages as a part of that spectrum, as experiments in participatory governance, should become a part of that discussion. Thank you.